Hey team, we're going to learn how we can display a grid of products with CSS Grid. I'm Colby Fayok, and if this is your first time here, make sure you hit subscribe for future updates. This walkthrough is a preview of my new course on level up tutorials called Ecommerce on the Jamstack. In this course, I walk you through step by step how you can create a new application with Next.js, add a shopping cart with Snipcart, and add WordPress to dynamically manage all of your products. If you want to dive right in, head on over to Level Up Tutorials or find the link in the description. If you've done any shopping on the web, like most of us have, you're probably familiar that products are typically displayed in a grid fashion on a website. It's a good way to take advantage of vertical space and show a bunch of products all within a tiny space. So for our application, we're going to learn how we can display a grid of products using CSS Grid. If you're not yet familiar with CSS Grid, it's a great way to display your content in, well, a grid where it has a lot of great configurations, and you can even do advanced layouts like you might expect from a typical website. But for our site, we're going to learn how we can add these products right onto our Next.js application and how we can actually go through and use CSS Grid to dynamically show it in a responsive grid. If you want to follow along with this example, you can find the link in the description that has all the images that I'll use today. Alright, so we're making great progress here. We have a header and we have a footer, and it's kind of starting to look and feel like what an actual store would look like. But now we actually need the products that we're going to sell, as that's the whole point of having a store in the first place. Now for our store project, we're going to need a concept for what we're going to actually sell. Now if you have your own online store, it probably makes sense to use your own products, your images, if you have those available. But for me, I need to come up with a concept, so I'm going to build a trading card store. I'm going to call my store Hyper Bros Trading Company, where I'm going to sell nice trading cards of some of our favorite characters from our favorite games, where people are going to be able to come and buy these cards from my store. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is update the name of my store, because it's no longer Colby's store and it's no longer my store, it's Hyper Bros. So let's update that in our code. Now, just like we did in our previous lessons, the first thing we can do is update the header, where if we head over to the header.js file, I can update that to Hyper Bros Trading Cards. I'm also going to copy that line, so I'm going to head over to my index.js file where we have our footer, where at the bottom, I can update that as well to my Hyper Bros Trading Cards. So now that we have our store, let's actually add those cards. Now, starting off in our index.js file, our home page, I'm going to scroll down and find this main tag where I'm actually going to get rid of everything inside of that main tag, because we're going to start from scratch so that we can really build the content that we want. Now, before we add anything else in here, if we remember from the header component, we created a container component where it's going to allow us to create a consistent way to narrow our content throughout the entire application. So I'm going to first import in my container component, and then I'm going to scroll back down to the main tag where I'm going to add that container. And then finally, let's add an H1 where when we're creating a website, we want to make sure we have a good H1 that represents the content on the page. And since this is our home page, we probably want to use the title of our store. So I'm going to again put Hyper Bros Trading Cards. Then I'll hit save. If we look at the browser, we can see that it's a little bit wonky. All of our content is kind of being smushed together, but that's because the default styles of Next.js have it set so that it's flexed inside of that container of the browser and that it's centered within all the content. While when we add our content inside of there, that's going to stretch out for us, let's also get rid of some of those default styles so it looks a little bit more normalized, especially if we're creating new pages that might not have enough content to fill that space. Now, if we open up our DevTools, we can start looking at the different elements and seeing where this is actually happening. Where on this home container, we can see this flexbox, especially in this particular case with Chrome DevTools, where we see that space that's pushing down because of flexbox. If we go down to these styles and uncheck the display flex, we can see that the header goes to the top of the page. And we also will lose that alignment that Next.js was adding to our page, where if you're an English-speaking country, you now have your page aligned left, where others, it might be aligned in the typical way that your language is displayed. But we also won't need these other flexbox related items, and also we can get rid of this height attribute, as we might run into some weird issues later if we leave that on there, since really we don't want to have our page fixed at 100 viewport height for the remainder of our different pages. So we can find those styles inside of our home.module.css. And really, we can just get rid of this entire thing, where we're not going to need any of these really in order to have our application working as expected. And if we go back over to the index.js and we actually look, we can find this class name with the styles.container on this div that's wrapping our entire page, which we really don't need. Now, speaking of getting rid of some of those styles, if we go to home.module.css, there's some styles that we're no longer using. Like, we're no longer using this main class since we got rid of it on our main tag. And we also don't need some other things like the footer A. We don't need this title since we got rid of the title. And we also don't need the description or this code block or the grid or the card and really any of this other code. So we can go ahead and get rid of it and clean things up. And if we look back inside of our browser, we can see that things are still looking the same since we really didn't remove anything that we're actually using. And we're in a good spot to get started with our own personal styles for this homepage. So now in our code, we want to show the cards that we have available. So let's first add an H2 that says available cards. And now we can actually start creating that card UI. So I'm going to start off with a list element where I'm going to go ahead and create my first item, where I know I'm going to have an image. So I'm going to start off by creating that one image and currently leave this blank. We'll add it in a second, but I know I'm also going to want to have some kind of title for my product name. Then I want to add a price where let's start off with $99.99. And then I finally want to add a button where I'm going to say add to cart. So now let's actually add an image where we can see that inside of this public directory, I have my images directory, where inside of public is really going to live any of the static files or assets that you want to serve from your application. Where if my website is colbyfayok.com, any of these files from this directory and onward would be located at colbyfayok.com/that directory. So in this instance, if I wanted to access Bowser or Bowser Hollow, it would be /images/Bowser-Hollow. So let's start off with that one where I'm going to reference /images/Bowser-Hollow.jpg. And we want to also always make sure we have an alt value. So I'm going to say Bowser Hollow. And then we can also update the name since we know the item that we're going to show. So Bowser Holographic. And let's keep the price the same. And let's see what this actually looks like. We can see that we're starting off with our first card, but we also notice that it's way too huge and it's not quite styled up how we want it to be. Now to start off, inside of our project, we have a little bit of an issue with images where out of the box, they're going to just kind of show up as the size that they are if you're not specifying any values. But we want to make sure that that's going to fit its container. So what we can do is on any image elements in our project, we can set a max width of 100%. That way, at least it will scope itself down to the width of our actual container, where we can see this is still pretty big, but we'll fix that in a second here. When adding styles inside of a Next.js project that aren't specific to a module, we want to add them in our globals file, where if we scroll down to the bottom, we can add a new image where we're going to say max width 100%. And we can see that back inside of our project, if we reload the page, it'll now have that style for us. Now, before we go further, I'm going to just clone this a couple times, and I'm not going to go ahead and actually update any of the data yet, just so that we have something to work with as we're building out this UI. Now to start styling this, like before, we can do this right inside of the browser, where we can find our UL element, and let's start off by removing the default styles, because by default, we're going to have this little dot here, which is typical for lists, but we don't want that. So I'm going to say list style none. And I'm also going to remove the padding and the margin that comes by default on the list element. So I'm going to say padding 0, margin 0, and we can see that it removed the space from the side. Now, ultimately, I want to be able to show these cards in a grid. So fortunately for us, we can use CSS Grid to achieve that, where let's start off by adding display grid. Now, as we can see, it didn't actually do anything to start. So now we actually have to configure how we want our grid to look. So next, we're going to define grid template columns, where we're going to say we want to repeat this logic, where we're going to say we want our items to auto fit, but we want them to be around 200 pixels. We can already see with that it's only taking up those 200 pixels for each of our different items, and it's looking already a little bit like a grid. Now, another thing that we can do on this grid template columns is instead of only adding 200 pixels, we can say min max, where our first argument is going to be that 200 pixels, but we're also going to add one FR, where if we see what happens now, it's going to take up the remainder of that space for our different rows. Now, the nice thing about this is we can see that we now can make our items responsive, where they're still going to have a minimum size of 200 pixels, but as we scale our browsers inside of our browser, we can see that they'll scale along with the width and the dimensions of that viewport size. So if we notice, we have one other issue with this though, is where our items are hung up right against each other and they're not giving any breathing room so that people can easily read each item on their own. So on our grid, I'm going to add a new property called grid gap, which I'm going to set equal to 3em, and we can already see that they space out a little bit. If we hover over our list item, we can see that it even shows that gap inside of our browser, and it's giving us a little bit more breathing room as we scale our browser up and down with the size. But before we go any further, let's copy all these styles into our project, where I'm going to open back up my home.module.scss file, and I'm going to add a new class called products, where I'm going to set all those styles right inside. And over inside my index.js file, I'm going to go to my UL, and I'm going to add a class name of styles products. We can see that when we refresh the page, we have all of our styles now. And even if we go back inside of our code editor, and maybe we can clone a couple more of these elements just to see what happens, we can see that our Bowser page will update and we have a lot of Bowser hollows now. The cool thing though is using those couple lines of CSS Grid, we were able to add a really great looking grid right inside of our page. But inside of our store, we know that we don't only want to sell Bowser cards, we want to sell some cards of the good characters. Now, inside of my code, I don't want to have to manually update all of this HTML anytime I want to make a change to a product. If I wanted to change something regarding the HTML and do it for all elements, I would have to make that change across all the different products, where I can instead store that data as a data file or in a CMS like we'll see in later lessons, where I can automatically run over all of those different products and show the same UI for each one. So inside of my project, I'm going to create a new folder under source, and I'm going to call this one data, where inside of that, I'm going to create a new file, and I'm going to call that products.json. Inside of this file, I'm going to define all of my product data. So to start, I'm going to set it as an array, where I'm going to have a bunch of different objects, where I want a couple things. I'm going to want an ID, I'm going to want a title, I'm going to want a price, and I'm going to want an image. We can start off with Bowser again. So we're going to define an ID, and let's call that Bowser holographic. And what we want to do is we want our ID to be something that doesn't have things like spaces, as it just makes it easier to use in things like URLs or just as data generally in our application. So let's add a comma there, and then we can also add our title, where it's going to be something similar, but it's going to be the actual properly formatted title. Let's say Bowser holographic. Now, Bowser's probably a popular card, right? And especially if it's a holographic card. So let's add a price that kind of reflects that. Let's call it $286.99. And then finally, I'm going to add my image, where we're going to use the same path as before. So we're going to say images Bowser holo.jpg. Now, before we actually import this file in, just like we did before, let's add a new line inside of our JS config, where we're going to be able to specify @data in order to access that data from anywhere inside of our application. Make sure to also remove this extra comma at the end, as that's not valid JSON to have trailing commas inside of a JSON file. So now back inside of our home page, I'm going to import those products from @data/products.json. Where now I can take that variable and I'm going to scroll down inside of my UL, where I'm going to now create a loop where I'm going to map over each product, where I'm going to return a new item, and that item is going to basically be this list element that we added before. So we can add that in there, and now that we have access to this product, we can start swapping out these values to dynamic values. So first we have our product. Let's swap out our product.title. Also for our image, we can say product.image. For our alt, how about we add something dynamic where we can say card of, we're going to say product.title. For our price, we can do the same thing. product.price. And since we don't have anything to do dynamic yet with the add to cart, we can leave that as is for now. Now, one thing that's also important in React is we want to make sure that we add a key to the element that's going to be returned, the parent, inside of our map loop. So we want to make sure we add that key. And for that, we can use product.id, as we want to make sure that those are always unique. Then we can also get rid of all the other list items that we used for our example, where we're going to now do that dynamically. Where now, if we go to the application, we'll see that we're actually getting an error. Now, similar to before, since we added a change to our JS config, we got to make sure that we actually refresh our server whenever we make that change. So we can go ahead and restart our server at this point. But now when we refresh the page, we should see this one item where it's expected that we see only that item. We can even see that the new price is reflected there, but let's add some more cards. Back inside of my products.json file, I'm going to go ahead and paste in all of my other cards, where if we scroll up and look through these, they're all the same kind of data sets where we have our ID, our title, our price, and our image, but we just have it for a bunch of different items. The cool thing now is if we refresh the page, we can see that it updated with all of that new content that includes all of the cards that we have available for our store. Now really at this point, we have our grid of products, but let's make this look a little bit nicer. To start, I don't want to use that default button from the browser whenever I show a button. Instead, I'm going to create a button component. So to start, kind of similar to what we did with our container, I'm going to simply duplicate that directory, and I'm going to call it button. That way, it's a little bit easier to start off my new component. I'm going to rename all those files to include button instead of my container. And then inside of those files, similarly, I'm just going to update all the different references to use that button inside of the container instead of the container. Where just like this, I can update my class name to button class name. I can update my name of my component to button, the class name that I'll be using, as well as the export, so that anywhere that we see a container, we can make sure that that says button. Now, if we open up that module.scss, we want to make sure that that says button as well, where there we can start building out our button styles. Now, like we always do, we can start designing this button inside of the browser. So I'm going to first start off by saying font size 1em, because I want to make sure that that's a little bit bigger and it's a little small there. How about we make the color white, and I'm going to make the background color this nice green that I found. To get rid of some more of those default styles, I'm going to say border none. I'm going to make the font weight bold, and I'm going to transform the text to uppercase. Finally, I want to make sure that that still looks a little bit nicer, so I'm going to add a padding of 0.6 em, 1 em. That way it looks nicer, where the top padding and bottom padding is going to be a little bit shorter than the sides. And finally, when someone's actually hovering over this item, I want it to look like a button. So I'm also going to add a cursor of pointer. And we can see now that when I hover over this, it shows that hand. So now I'm going to copy all those styles, and I'm going to head back over to my editor, where I'm going to paste them under my button class. So now I can refresh the page, where now we're actually ready to use this button component inside of our application. So now I'm going to take this button, I'm going to head back over to my home page, and the first thing I need to do is actually import that button. But now if I scroll down, I'm going to replace the original add to cart button with our component. And if we head back over to our browser, we should see that they're all updated with our new button. Now, one thing that we might notice is we still have a full width button here, which isn't exactly what we were looking for. If we inspect this, we can see that our button is actually a div. Now, often when people are creating components, they do that with a lot of div elements, where because you can use a div, you can kind of style it as you want. But in our case, we want to still make sure that we're using a button, as it's still important to use semantic HTML when defining new components within your project. So we're going to head back over to our editor. I'm going to update this div to button. Now when we're back inside of our project, we can see that they've all updated, and we now have our nice HTML buttons. Now this probably can pass, but I want to be a little bit picky with my styles, and I want to make sure that the spacing looks a little bit nicer for my title and my actual price. For my title here, I want to make the font size a little bit bigger, where I think that looks good, and I also want to make sure that the margin is a little bit better. So I'm going to say 0.4 em to set the top margin a little bit shorter than it was. Then I'm just going to set 0 for all the rest. Now I also want to tweak the margin of my price, so I'm going to inspect that, and And I'm actually going to set the same margin. Let's try 0.4 EM000. And I think that looks pretty good. The spacing looks pretty nice, and the add to cart button is still set apart so that people can easily click it. So now back inside of the code, I'm going to add a class name to both of these elements, where I'm going to say styles, product, title, and I'm also going to add these to a new line just because out of personal preference, I don't like those lines to get super long. And then I'm going to also add a class name of styles, product, price. Inside of my home.module.scss, I'm going to say product title, and we're going to set that to font size 1.4 EM, as well as margin 0.4 EM00. Then also my product price, which I'm going to set my margin to the same thing of 0.4 EM00. And we can see that all of our items were updated to those same styles, and it's looking pretty great at this point. Now the final thing I'm going to do is I want to add a little bit more spacing between my available cards and the cards themselves to again make sure that my spacing is nice and even and consistent throughout the app. So for this, I'm going to simply add a margin top of 3 EM. I think that's looking good. And back inside my SCSS, because I already have that margin, I can actually just add it to that same statement as shorthand, where this is going to define my top, this is going to define my right and left side, and then finally my bottom, so that also doesn't get the top value of 3 EM. So this is looking good, but let's make sure that it's actually working on Netlify, where we're currently deploying our application. Now, if we look inside of Netlify, when we pushed that code, we can actually see that it failed. Now, if we remember from previous lessons, we are subject to the linting rules of Next.js, where because they enforce use of their next image component instead of the simple image tag, we're actually failing our linting. This is another use where we want to make sure that we're staying vigilant for when we're trying to make sure that our application is working and linted. Otherwise, this will prevent our application from being deployed. If we go inside of our terminal, we can run yarn lint, and we can see that Next.js will go again through that linting stage, and we see the same thing where it says that we can't use the standard image tag. The nice thing, it even shows what line of what file is actually having an error. And if we go into index.js, we can see on line 31, it's because of that image that we just added. Now, since we already have it imported, we can still just take that image and we can replace it with our image tag. The only thing that we need to add now is an additional width and height of our base image to make sure Next.js can understand how to load this image. Now, because this is going to happen responsively, I'm going to just use the intrinsic size, which is the actual size of the file. And you can also find this size local on your file system, but we can see here that it's 864 by 1200, so I'm going to set that as my width and height. So my width of 864 and my height of 1200 pixels. And we can now see that my images are loading, and it's even doing so with all these styles that Next.js uses to optimize things and make it nice and responsive inside of our project. Now, just as an aside from a performance perspective, the reason that that width and height doesn't technically matter for the very first load is because Next.js also adds the dynamic source set where it's going to load images at different sizes depending on the size of the browser. So we can make sure that our application is nice and performant with the images that are going to be loaded for our visitors. But now we can run yarn lint again to make sure that we don't have any errors inside of our application, which we don't. So we can add this back to our Git, where we're going to commit that up and fixing linting errors with our images and push that up. Where we can see this time it was a success, and if we open up our application, we can see our beautiful new project on the web. But now at this point, we have our store, we have our products, and I think we're ready to get started actually making these available for people to buy. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from this preview of my course e-commerce on the Jamstack. CSS Grid is a super powerful way that we can dynamically lay out content on our websites. If you want to keep on going and build your online store, make sure you head over to Level Up Tutorials or the link in the description to get started today. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and subscribe for future updates. Thanks for watching.